Hello, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. If you are new, welcome to my true crime channel where we discuss wrong-uns of all kinds from all over the world. And today's case begins with a love story of sorts. The date is the 19th of January 2012, and in a village named Tetbury in the Cotswolds, a man walks into a fashion boutique where 54-year-old Carolyn Woods is behind the cashier's desk. He's the last customer of the evening and she looks up to greet him. Looking back at her is a tall, dark, handsome man who is looking for a new jacket, and he asks Carolyn to select a few items for him to try on. Now, Carolyn hasn't been in Tetbury that long. She's been divorced for around 9 years after having been in a marriage spanning over 2 decades and has 2 grown-up daughters. She moved to Tetbury for a fresh start after the sale of the house she had with her husband and is renting while she finds a house to buy. Everything is going pretty well for Carolyn in this lovely little job in a boutique in a lovely village. And when this handsome man walks in and shows an interest in her, she thinks, well, this could be the perfect time to meet a new man. And this man is extremely engaging. He looks at Carolyn very intently and oozes charisma. He buys a jacket and asks for Carolyn's number. In a very out-of-character move for Carolyn, she hands it over and he exits the shop, leaving Carolyn in quite the daze. Now, this man's name is Mark, and Mark texts Carolyn pretty much straight away and asks her out on a date. Carolyn's had a few dates since she moved to Tetbury, but they've never worked out. She's not looking for another 22-year marriage. She wants something different, someone exciting to just enjoy being in the moment with. And this Mark has that energy in spades. The date arrives and Mark is waiting outside for her and they walk in together. She puts her bag on the floor and Mark notices this and immediately says, "Never do that. It's bad luck if you put your bag on the floor. All your money will run away." Anyway, they get talking and Mark is a chatterbox but far from boring. He's extremely engaging and very forthcoming. He tells her so much about himself and Carolyn hangs on every word. He tells her he went to Eton and then Oxford for his education, that he's a banker and tax exile based in Switzerland, and that he's flown in from Geneva especially for this date and is flying back that night. He tells her he can speak 7 languages, has a photographic memory and can fly his own plane. He goes on to tell her that he hates his mother, that she preferred dogs to children, and he had an isolated, unhappy childhood. Whilst Mark is giving a lot away, it doesn't put Carolyn off. He's so fascinating and charismatic. She's happy to learn everything about him because she's so drawn to him. He tells her that he has luxury homes across the world and access to tables at the best restaurants. He's clearly an extremely wealthy man, but Carolyn stops him. She says, "I'm not interested in your money." He says, "Oh, I know, but there's something I have to tell you. I'm not normal." And Carolyn likes this. She likes different, and he is clearly different and intelligent, energetic, charismatic and handsome. Not normal was okay with her. Mark tells Carolyn he can read people like books. They're so transparent to him. And he can tell that not only is she extremely attractive, but she has all the traits that he likes in a woman, and she's very special indeed. The date ends and Carolyn is captivated. She's had an incredible night with Mark and cannot wait to see him again, and it seems the feeling is mutual. Things are extremely full on from here on out. After just 2 dates, Mark tells Carolyn the thought of being with anyone else repulses him. She's the only one for him and he's falling for her. He's never been loved in his life and he has never loved anyone in his life, but now that's changing for him and Carolyn is overwhelmed and excited by this. This might seem to be moving fast to the rest of us, but Carolyn has always believed in love at first sight. She's a hopeless romantic, so this doesn't seem so strange to her. Carolyn, before the first date, did ask for a business card from Mark so she could Google him for safety reasons, but he forgets. And then the second time she asks, he takes offence to it, which makes her feel bad for not trusting him. Over the next few days, Mark takes Carolyn to an airfield with vintage aircraft and tells her this is his business, restoring the airfield. He says it would be a great investment for her, but she says no. Property is the only investment she's comfortable with. She has the proceeds from the sale of her marital home and she will only be buying herself a new house with it. No investments. Next, Mark takes her to a luxury house he's considering purchasing. They can't get in, but they can look around the courtyard. He asks her to tell him if she likes it. She's taken aback by this and he says, "You know we're going to be together. There's no point in holding back." He keys the code into the gate and they drive into the courtyard. She thinks it's sudden to be looking at homes together, but he says they're meant to be, so why wait? It's no doubt a luxury home and she tells him she loves it. He's clearly super wealthy. Now, Mark never spends much time with Carolyn. Their meetups are intense, very intimate, but fleeting. Only a few hours here and there. He never stays the night with her, which is strange to her, but he did tell her at the start it would be 18 months before he could get into any kind of real relationship, and she's about to find out why. Mark comes over and he is stressed, he's anxious, and he tells her the reason there is this 18-month delay is because he works for MI6. MI6 have found out that he's in a serious relationship and they are not happy. He tells her that his bosses are giving him a hard time. He can't get out of his contract with MI6 for 18 months, but if she's willing to stick with him, it'll all be over soon. She says she's happy to wait and won't breathe a word to anyone about his job. He says she's so reliable, they share the same morals and values, and that's why they're made for each other. At this stage, Carolyn realises she doesn't know Mark's surname, so after the third time asking, he finally tells her it's Conway, Mark Conway. Over the next few days, Mark's visits remain short and fleeting. They are usually last minute and often cancelled last minute due to his job. One day, he turns up to Carolyn's house with a 2-year-old girl. He says she's his niece. He speaks to her in Spanish and says he wants to adopt her as she's from a troubled home. She'll be safer with him, he says. Mark is always quick to point out how caring he is and how much he puts other people before himself, and this little girl is an example of that, which to Carolyn is very important as it shows he's got a good heart, like she does. Mark asks for a jacket from Carolyn's shop. It's £35, but he doesn't pay her back. This irritates Carolyn because it's not so much the amount, but it's the principle of it, and her previous marriage had been a little tense around money, so she didn't want to get into that situation again, and so she asks for the £35 back. Mark says he's shocked she's brought it up. It's such a small amount. Of course he'll pay it back, he says, but this kind of money is chicken feed, and she's going to be a very rich woman being with him, and she needs to get used to that. Next, Mark tells her to start house hunting for them with a budget of $3 million, which she does, and over time they view a few houses. Carolyn can't quite believe that she's met the man of her dreams, and within the space of a few weeks they are house hunting together. Carolyn, if you recall, wanted to buy her own house with the proceeds from her marital home, but Mark tells her to just put that on hold for now. He's buying them a home for the two of them. He tells her that she should put that money in a Barclays account because he knows the chief executive of Barclays and it's a much better interest rate there. She's reluctant to do this, but Mark books an appointment for her and she goes with his assistant Paul and transfers all of her money into this new account. Paul, I should add, is sort of Mark's right-hand man. He drives him around everywhere, does PA-type tasks and really just handles Mark's affairs when asked. Mark finds a property for the pair to live in Bath and he starts renovating it because as much as it's already a luxury home, he wants it to be even better. But one day he takes a call within earshot of Carolyn and he is discussing a cash flow issue. She asks what the issue is. Mark needs £26,000 to continue with renovations until cash from elsewhere becomes available. Carolyn offers to lend him this money and he refuses. She says it's fine. She wants him to know she trusts him after the £35 jacket incident, and it's for her home too. Reluctantly, Mark agrees to take a lesser amount of £22,000, which is transferred to Mark's assistant Paul, who is dealing with all the contractors. Luckily, they're able to process this transaction quickly because they're at the bank. They were planning to go to the bank just shortly before Mark got that call. A couple of days after that first transaction, Mark calls Carolyn from the cockpit of a jet that he's about to fly, saying that he has to go on a dangerous mission to Iran. Carolyn spends all night scared to death, not knowing whether or not Mark has survived this perilous mission, but to her relief, he turns up the next day to her home. He makes a call whilst there. He quotes encryption numbers and asks for a secure line. He then tells someone he calls Sir that the mission has been completed successfully. Carolyn assumes he must be speaking to someone extremely high up within MI6, maybe even the Foreign Secretary at the time, William Hague. Anyway, Carolyn is extremely relieved to see that Mark is in one piece. He stays for a few hours as usual and leaves. A few days later, the same issue happens again with the contractor, and Carolyn offers to transfer some more money over. And again, a few days after that. And this goes on for a while, with Mark eventually presenting her with 2 loan agreements, 2 of which add up to £180,000, and another one which she doesn't actually remember signing, but she must have, which comes to £375,000. Carolyn, in total, drip feeds Mark the entire contents of her bank account, which is over £750,000. And that's not savings. Carolyn isn't a wealthy woman in the sense that she has a healthy bank account plus the 750. No, she lives a modest life with a modest income. Aside from the proceeds from the sale of her marital home, 750,000, that's every penny she has. But it's not a huge deal because Mark is extremely wealthy. £750,000 is nothing to him. And she hasn't given Mark her money. She's invested that money into the renovation of a house that she plans to live in with Mark. Meanwhile, Mark now tells Carolyn that she must start taking security very seriously. There are people out there who want him dead, so by association, she needs to be very careful. She's provided with a new phone and a new laptop with spy software in there, so Mark can keep an eye on her for her own safety. At the end of each day, she's instructed to delete all texts and emails, especially ones from him. Reluctantly, she agrees to this, and if she doesn't want to, he takes her devices from her and he does it himself. And life continues as normal over the next few days, bearing in mind all of this has happened within weeks of them meeting. Mark continues to work in Geneva, to work on the airfield he's renovating, whilst also taking on dangerous missions to Iran and Syria. Sometimes he'll pepper in details about himself. He'll say he knows Hillary Clinton, Mr. Putin, and is the illegitimate son of George Soros, the man who is known for breaking the Bank of England by betting against the pound in 1992. And Carolyn is just amazed by how fascinating Mark is and feels sorry for him that he never had a happy home life. If you're wondering where Carolyn's friends and family are during all of this, well, they start to worry, saying they don't trust this guy. They haven't met him, but from what they've heard, they don't know if he can be trusted. They say, look at his name, Mark Conway. He has the mark of a con man. They point out that there has been no sign of these many cars and houses and luxury items that he claims to own. They are sure she's going to be conned and her identity stolen, and they ask her to please take a step back and question what's happening here. But as often happens when family or friends get involved in relationships, Carolyn is just insulted. They haven't even met Mark, and to her they've overstepped the line and interfered. She feels under attack. They need to accept that this is the real thing. They're meant to be, and her family and friends should just be happy for her. She tells Mark what they've said, and he takes her phone off her and writes a text to them to say the house is coming in April, the car is arriving any day now, we are fine. He says they're sad and miserable and she just needs to cut them off altogether. The date is the 29th of February 2012 and Mark mentions that it's a leap year. So Carolyn should propose to him as per tradition of women asking men to marry them on a leap year. And so Carolyn proposes to Mark and he accepts. Bearing in mind this whole story I've told you so far has taken place within 6 weeks of them having met. Mark takes Carolyn shopping. They pick out some designer items for both of them, which is not what she's used to, but remembering his words that she needs to get used to being a rich woman, she goes with it. When they get to the till to ring the items up, Mark looks directly at Carolyn, waiting for her to pay. She recognises this is a test, that she's willing to get used to this kind of lavish lifestyle, so she pays for all of the items. A few days later, Mark collects Carolyn in a helicopter and takes her on a date. He remarks that they should really buy a house with a helipad at some point. The couple never go on normal dates due to Mark's job. It will be way too dangerous, what with his many enemies baying for blood. Next, Carolyn starts planning their wedding. Mark says he's friends with Karl Lagerfeld, so it would be ideal to get the wedding dress from there, but as they want to marry fairly soon, she's better off just getting something from a standard wedding dress shop, which she does, and she hangs it in her home in anticipation of her big day, which he says will be lavish with no expense spared. Over time, Mark suggests Carolyn quit her job as she won't need the money now. And he also suggests she throws out the majority of her clothes too. And she should see someone about refreshing her face with Botox. And so she quits her job, gives most of her clothes away, but stops short at any Botox because Carolyn likes herself. I should note here, Carolyn is a confident woman. She's extremely switched on and intelligent. She likes who she is, and the idea of getting anything done like Botox is a step too far for her. Then Mark has Carolyn move into a luxurious place in Bath. Carolyn doesn't really like it. It has a lot of windows and a lot of footfall outside from tourists, so it feels very exposed. But she moves in if it means being with Mark. Mark suggests she gives his assistant Paul all of her belongings from her house because she simply doesn't need them in this luxury home. So reluctantly, she gives Paul the entire contents of her house, furniture, everything, aside from a few sentimental items, and she moves in without Mark because of course it's still within the 18 months, so she could not expect him to move in with her yet. Carolyn is told for her own safety not to open the door to anyone. She even spends her birthday alone. Her relationships with family and friends are now strained due to her telling them to stay out of her relationship. Not long after, she receives a phone call from Mark telling her MI6 do not approve of their relationship, and as a result, they've poisoned him, so he's in hospital. Carolyn thinks if he's willing to put up with this level of torment to be with her, then she must be loyal to him no matter what. A week later, Mark makes a full recovery. Not long after this, he shows up at the door having returned from a mission to Syria with a bandaged arm where he's been shot. He stays for a couple of hours and leaves again, as per usual. And Carolyn is beside herself with worry because of this dangerous job he's got. She's always alone, worrying a lot, drinking a lot, isolated from family, and is a shadow of her former self. She's trapped in a house she hates. Mark has her money and is still reading all of her posts, emails and texts. Shortly after, Mark calls Carolyn to tell her that he's fallen down the stairs and cut his head badly. But as a result, the doctors have found a brain tumour and he's about to go in for surgery. He says she can't come to the hospital because MI6 are there. A few days later, as agreed with Mark, she parks in the hospital car park and he comes out to greet her with thick bandaging on his head with tubing sticking out. They speak briefly and he goes back into the hospital. She doesn't see him for a while as he recovers, so more alone time for Carolyn. By early 2013, Carolyn has had enough of the house and she moves out, finding somewhere to stay for a short while as she's now pretty badly in debt. Mark is not happy at all about her moving out and is becoming hot and cold with her. She wants her money back to be able to find her own house, and he says he'll pay her back on the 3rd of April. April comes and goes and he still hasn't paid her, and by this point she's couch surfing in her friends' houses, because she's in huge debt and is by this point frantic about where her money is. She's at breaking point. Carolyn keeps in touch with Mark for months, hoping that if she keeps in touch with him, he'll pay it back, but no money comes. She's having panic attacks every night and is only able to keep going with her life because of the love for her 2 daughters. By June 2013, Carolyn comes to realise finally that she's been robbed of everything. She has no belongings, nothing to her name. She's lost friendships and family members after being in that house, isolated, completely controlled by this man. Carolyn tells Mark if he doesn't show his face soon, she's going to the police. And then she makes a shocking discovery beyond anything she could have possibly imagined. Carolyn is in touch with a man named James, a former business associate of Mark, and they agree to meet. There, James tells her everything that he has only recently found out himself, and it's devastating. Mark is, I'm sure you've worked out by now, a complete fraud, as well as many other things. Mark Conway is actually Mark Acklom. He has a wife and 2 children who live just down the road from where Carolyn has been living in the luxury home. He owns no houses at all, he doesn't work for MI6, and in actual fact he's been a criminal since he was 16 years old. As you can imagine, Carolyn is in a complete daze. She had planned to marry this man. She's got a dress. She cannot believe he's got a wife and kids. If you remember, she'd actually met one of those kids. That niece he turned up with that day saying he wanted to adopt. He probably just couldn't get a sitter that day and thought, I'll take her with me, cook up some sort of story, she'll believe it. She remembers the things he said in her company, like, I'm not normal, and if you put your bag on the floor, your money will run away. These 2 statements were probably the only true things he's ever said to her. Carolyn phones Mark and says, give me my money. He says, I'll give it to you, everything's fine. She says, give me my money. Mark hangs up the phone and never contacts Carolyn ever again. Carolyn goes immediately to Islington police station and tells her story, and they aren't really interested. In fact, she feels more like a suspect than a victim, and it'll take another 6 years before anything is done about Mark Acklom. But who is Mark Acklom? Well, I don't think anyone truly knows the answer to that aside from the man himself, but here's what we do know. Mark Richard George Acklom was born in Lambeth in London in 1973 to his parents Brian and Diana Acklom. His family were pretty well off and he was the eldest of 4 children. It was an extremely difficult birth. Suction and forceps had to be used, and so when Mark was born, he'd really gone through it, and that was evident on his little body. And his mother later in life questioned whether this traumatic birth had some neurological effect on Mark. He's never actually been tested for any mental health illnesses, so no one knows. The reason Diana questioned this was because as soon as he was old enough to walk and talk, Mark had behavioural issues. An example of this is when Mark was small, he kicked the family puppy because it was in the way whilst he was on the stairs. Diana found this lack of empathy or affection strange, and it was just one of many examples that made her concerned for her son. At age 11, he was sent off to boarding school, attending Eastbourne College, and he was okay at most subjects, but there was one subject that seemed incredibly natural to Mark. He shone above all other students in his business studies class. Mark was so good at business studies, his teacher introduced him to the stock market, told him how it worked, and allowed him to have a go at investing. But this soon snowballed when his teacher gave 15-year-old Mark upwards of £15,000 of his own money to invest. Don't ask me how Mark managed to persuade a grown man to part with that amount of money to a child, but he did. And I think you've probably already guessed that this teacher would never see that money again. So Mark is probably a little drunk on his own success now. If he's clever enough to talk thousands of pounds out of an educated man at such a young age, what else is he capable of? Well, he sets about finding out. Mark's dad, Brian, who works in finance, allows him at 16 years old to work at the business he owns. He, of course, tells friends that he's pretty much running the place. Because if there's one thing Mark likes to do, it's embellish to impress people. So much so, to prove he's a high earner, he, at 16 years old, steals his dad's golden Amex card. He hits London straight away, shopping with his friends in Harrods, staying at the Savoy Hotel, hiring private jets so they can take holidays around Europe, eating lobster and drinking champagne, racking up thousands of pounds on whatever he wants. Of course, after a while, Brian realises what Mark has done and cancels the card, meaning Mark has to take his shenanigans to the next level. Now, Mark was always supremely confident, able to talk anyone into anything, as we know. He also looked older than he was. He dressed like a man in his 20s, and he used all of these attributes to walk into a local building society and convince them to give him, 16-year-old Mark, a mortgage worth £500,000. They gave a child £500,000 and he went and purchased a 5-bedroom home with it. As a result of all this, Diana Acklom had no choice but to go to the police and tell them what her son had done, which must have been really difficult for her and Brian to have to do. Mark's actions had lost Brian his business, the family's livelihood. They also had to sell their house to pay off his debts. Their marriage broke down. He was ruining their lives in real time. They really had no choice. He had to be stopped. So Mark attended trial in 1991 in relation to well over 100 charges of theft and deception. His defence tried to get a psychiatric examination of Mark, suggesting he was potentially mentally ill, but the judge refused to accept this, viewing this as the excuse of a wicked conman, and he is sentenced to 4 years in Felton Young Offenders Institution. I will say here that the judge should have granted that examination, and maybe if he had, Mark's life could have been different, or maybe not. Of course, this story hits the news because it's so out of the ordinary and extremely embarrassing for the mortgage company who gave a child £500,000. Mark says this really hindered his life for many years following his conviction because, of course, for a while everyone knew who he was and what he'd done. Whilst inside, Diana hoped that this would be the shock that Mark needed to get himself back on the straight and narrow, but he spirals, sending his mother letters saying he's going to hurt himself. But these threats stop after he is prescribed Valium, which he stayed on for a long time. Mark launches an appeal whilst inside, and he has his prison sentence reduced from 4 years to 2 years. When he's released, he is 20 years old. He struggles to find work due to his celebrity status, but eventually gets a job as an administrator and marries in 1994, fathering 2 children. Even on his marriage certificate, he writes that he's a barrister. He has no legal qualifications whatsoever and works in admin. He just can't help himself. Then a few years pass and it seems Mark remains on the straight and narrow, or he wasn't caught doing anything, one of the two. And it's during this time, after the birth of his second child, that he abandons his family and in 1997 leaves the UK altogether and hops around Europe. Mark speaks fluent Spanish, so it's very easy for him to navigate his way around Spain in particular. In 1999, Mark is arrested in Spain and sentenced to 3.5 years for fraud. He's sentenced to 6 months in Spanish prison again in 2004 for burglary and dishonesty, and then again in 2006 he's sentenced to 21 months in Spanish prison for fraud, this time telling people he owned the Gran Hotel Bali in Benidorm, which came unstuck when the actual owners of the hotel pulled him up and said, "No you don't, pal, we own it." So off he went to prison again. Then in 2009, Mark marries again to a Spanish lady called Maria Ros Rodriguez. They have 2 daughters, and around 2010 they move back to the UK. So Mark is back in the UK, and in the 2 years before he meets Carolyn, has a wild old time getting up to his old tricks. He's going around the West Country meeting business associates, telling them he wants to renovate an airfield full of vintage aircraft, asking them to invest in it, just like he did Carolyn. An internet entrepreneur named Chris Frampton met Mark, who at that time was posing as a Dr. Zach Moss. They discussed the idea of putting on rock concerts at Formula One race meetings. Dr. Zach said he would raise the finance for it and work with Chris to make it happen. Zach said he knew Bernie Eccleston and had worked with him in the past, so he could put that contact to good use. Zach and Chris worked together, with Zach hiring Chris on a huge salary. But after 2 months, Chris still hadn't been paid a penny. Chris took Dr. Zach to court and did actually win £20,000, but as we know, Zach, aka Mark Acklom, doesn't have any money of his own, so Chris didn't receive any of that $20,000 and knows he never will. Because of the trauma Mark Acklom caused Chris and the money he lost out on, he actually became very ill, and his marriage also broke down as a result of the stress of encountering Mark Acklom. This man just ruins lives the second he walks into them. And there's many more stories just like this one, of intelligent people being conned by this man, prestigious organisations allowing him access to their innermost workings. Clifton College Bristol allowed him to fundraise for them, telling them he could get access to vintage cars and TV presenter Carol Vorderman for their events. Next, he meets Brigadier Libby, the regional head of the charity The Prince's Trust, telling him that he can raise £8 million no problem. Brigadier Libby listens to how he's been in the Royal Navy, knows Hillary Clinton, has served undercover in Northern Ireland, and he, whilst admitting finding him really plausible and fascinating, thankfully doesn't take him up on his offer. Imagine if Mark Acklom infiltrated a charity. I hate to think, honestly. Next, he meets David Hadfield, a man who he commissions to draw up plans to extend his luxury house. David agrees to draw up the plans until Mark tells him he'll pay him when the job's done. But due to the nature of the work, David says, "I need the money to be able to do the job," so thankfully he refuses to do it. Some people do escape Mark's clutches. Not many, but some. In fact, David took it one step further and hired a private detective to investigate Mark, who comes back and says, "This guy's a con man and he is ripping people off." The report says the police should be told as soon as possible about Mark Acklom and what he's doing, and David does exactly that. But the police do nothing. And unfortunately for her, around the same time, Mark Acklom walks into a fashion boutique and lays his eyes on Carolyn Woods. Now, you may remember I mentioned James. James is the man who told Carolyn about who Mark really was. And the reason he knew this is because he was another victim. James was offered a huge salary by Mark, but then never saw any of it. He was working for Mark in Spain for the company that he'd set up. They were based in luxury offices, which Mark had conned his secretary, Fernanda, into paying for, by promising he'd leave his wife for her and would pay her back. So she too lost thousands of euros because of Mark, and he obviously never left his wife for her either. Mark's many employees, including James, only found out that his whole business was a sham when the Spanish police came and hauled Mark away in handcuffs. In fact, it was only then that the police referred to him as Mark Acklom, and James found out his real name. So James was left to pick up the pieces. Employees who'd never been paid, including him, clients who were furious, a business that wasn't even real, and offices that hadn't been paid for. This ruined James. He lost everything, just like Carolyn and so many others. Mark had been arrested for selling luxury London flats to wealthy Spanish people that he, of course, didn't own. He was freed on bail and did a runner that night with his family to Italy. 4 months later, they dragged him back to Spain and put him on trial. He, of course, denied the whole thing, but is sentenced to 3 years in prison, and the men who gave him €200,000 each for deposits on those properties never saw that money again. During this time that Mark's been in Spain getting arrested, Carolyn has been trying to tell police back in the UK what he's done to her, but they are unable to do anything about it, and she's spiralling into a terrible depression and is completely penniless. In 2015, Mark applies for a pardon from prison and he is freed temporarily. He gives in his passport, but unbelievably, he goes on the run again. Then, in 2016, the UK finally put him on their most wanted list. Mark is a wanted man in multiple countries at this point, but he's vanished. He's spotted over the following 6 months around Europe, but always seems to outwit those looking for him, both police and journalists. Somehow he's managed to get himself a new passport and legally changed his name. He's still pulling cons on whoever crosses his path. Mark tells Harold Herbon he's working with Elon Musk, who has put 5 billion Swiss francs into his new company. So Harold invests 400,000 into this company and never hears from Mark or sees his money again. And then finally, on the 30th of June 2018, Mark Acklom at his luxury rented apartment in Switzerland is captured by Swiss armed police. They knock at the door and his wife lets them in. Rumour has it that a neighbour said it was like a Netflix drama, with Mark jumping over a fence to try to escape. Now, Switzerland have their own beef with Mark, so he isn't brought back to the UK until he's served time there for other fraud charges. But on the 22nd of February, he's brought back on an EasyJet flight from Geneva to Bristol. Even when the female detective on UK soil reads his charges out to him, he thanks her and strokes her arm, still looking for possible opportunities wherever they arise. In August 2019, he is charged with 20 counts of fraud and converting criminal property in connection with Carolyn Woods. But by striking a deal with police, he manages to get his charges down to just 5, and to those he pleads guilty, with the rest of the charges remaining on file. Mark claims that it was Carolyn who was obsessed with him. She was happy to give him money for anything he wanted because she was so infatuated with him. Luckily, in the face of overwhelming evidence, mostly gathered by Carolyn, the judge doesn't fall for Mark's lies like so many have before him, calling him ruthless and utterly selfish. With the plea bargain, Mark is sentenced to 5 years and 8 months, minus time already served, which is about as much as the judge could have given him. And Mark is expressionless as the sentencing is delivered. Now we're up to the present day, and Mark has since served his sentence in the UK and now resides in a Spanish jail after he was immediately extradited there to finish off the sentence he was given that he went on the run from partway through. It's expected he'll be out of prison around October 2023. Now, a lot went on during the time that Mark was with Carolyn, a lot more than I've been able to put in this video, else it would go on for hours. But we'll never fully understand how Mark got away with a lot of the things that he did, how he managed to do what he did so convincingly. But there are a few loose ends that we can tie off. Mark's assistant, Paul, if you remember him, he did get arrested at one point, but police believe that he was ultimately an unwitting accomplice of Mark. And even if he wasn't, he did help police a lot with their investigation regarding Carolyn. So they decided he was too small fry to bring charges against, given they had such a mammoth task on their hands bringing Mark to justice. And it really was a mammoth task. There was so much evidence to collate. And so for that reason, Paul was released. The reason Mark had Carolyn only wear designer clothes was because he needed her to look rich. He told the letting agent of the luxury home in Bath that Carolyn was Maria del Pino y Calvo Sotelo, a very rich Spanish businesswoman who doesn't look unlike Carolyn. They both had short dark bobs at the time. So when the letting agent saw Carolyn around the property, they believed that it was this other woman and they let the house out to him. The reason he got her in that property at all was really for his own ends. He'd find ways to get her out of the house and then invite business associates around to show the place off. He also got various models over to the house, claiming he was a photographer who would take pictures of them and get them contracts worth thousands. Of course, they never got those contracts, and I think we can work out for ourselves what was in that for him. Then Carolyn would come home and he'd claim he had to go back to work at MI6, but was actually going down the road to his wife and children. If you're wondering why she believed Mark worked for MI6, well, he actually went into the MI6 office car park. He strolled right past the armed guards to get in, and he did this several times right in front of her, so she believed what she saw. His fake brain tumour had been expertly bandaged when Carolyn saw him at the hospital, but who did that? Well, he was also in a relationship with a doctor at the time and probably made up some reason to get her to bandage his head. He was taking her for a lot of money too, but she has always refused to discuss it when asked, hence why he's never faced any charges in relation to her and we don't know who she is. The £375,000 loan agreement that Carolyn didn't remember signing, well, she didn't sign it. Multiple documents were found later with her signature on that Mark had forged himself. It's also thought a woman in Cheltenham also lost £1 million to Mark, but again, no charges have been brought. I think there's many more victims of Mark Acklom that we don't know about, but they're just too embarrassed to come forward, which is a shame. I don't think there's any embarrassment to being duped by a career conman. He's honed his craft since he was 15. He is a natural at this, so it's understandable that by his 40s, he's incredible at what he does. As for Mark's mother Diana, she still to this day in her 70s has to work 2 jobs as she spends the rest of her life paying off Mark's enormous debts. I hope I've tied up some loose ends there. If I haven't, just let me know and I'll try to explain it for you. But a lot of how he managed these things, gained access to luxury homes, how he walked into the MI6 car park past armed guards, no one knows and we may never know. Carolyn waited 7 years to see this man face justice for what he did to her. It wasn't just the money, it was the isolation from family and friends. It was keeping her indoors with the curtains shut. It was spying on her phone and laptop, controlling her every move, playing mind games so she would try to prove her loyalty to him. It was a lot more than just money. She'll likely never see a penny of that £750,000 again. But her daughters have carried her through, and being a mother kept her going. But if you're looking for a somewhat happy ending to this, James, the man who exposed Mark to Carolyn, actually became very friendly with Carolyn and they began a relationship. They bonded over what Mark did to them and their relationship blossomed. They're working hard to someday between them be able to own their own home again. But it's a long road ahead after both being financially ruined by what that man did. Carolyn is glad she's raised Mark's profile so much that he'll have a hell of a time trying to do this to people in future. A lot of people know his face now, and that's because of her bravery in exposing what happened to her and taking the humiliation and accusations of being an idiot for believing his lies. I personally think she's done a lot of potential future victims a huge favour. She's now piecing her life back together with James, and good for them. And that's it. I hope you found this case interesting. If you did, please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Feel free to suggest cases that you were interested in. I only want to provide content that you actually want to watch. With that said, have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.